I'm going to start with a very brief introduction about why are we here and what's this very unusual exhibition, because it started off, to be honest, as a joke. Because when we came across this painting that Alma was talking about, and I urge you to go look at it later, in which the face of a woman is shown with the word montagne, mountain, written over her face, we were really, really taken by the painting. But the first question was, is this a landscape painting? Could we think of landscape painting in a different way through Magritte? And so we decided to take apart only a section, or to look at 3 angles of Magritte's work in this exhibition, to think about, can we think of Magritte as a landscape painter? Not in order to argue that he is, but in order to think what it is that he does, and why is it that landscape is so interesting to him, and he keeps returning to this theme in different ways. And so the exhibition is divided into 3 galleries. The first gallery, from which you all came in, is called Frames of Reference, and it really looks at the way that Magritte used screens or divisions between the image and the landscape. So the entire room, as you would see, is filled with theater scenes, windows, canvases that conceal a landscape through which we see the landscape reflected, but really a continuous preoccupation with the idea of what I will say a bit more later on, but he called the problem of the window, the thing that is between us and the world and constantly comes in between this relationship. And the second gallery in which we're sitting includes a group of paintings all on the theme of the sky is the limit. Magritte was obsessed with clouds and sky painting, and he kept returning to it. And as you see, both in this room and in the next room that will be open shortly, there is a great deal of treatment of sky that is very different and broad in his practice. We're very privileged to include here not only a great selection of works, one of which many of you would know from the Museum of Modern Art here in the city, but also a new commissioned piece by a contemporary artist, Laure Prouvot, who had made her own word and image composition on the window behind you, and that reflects the text and image relationship that Magritte would do in a spatial way. And finally, we have the last gallery that looks at what we call human landscapes. And in a way, that was really that starting point of a human figure that is meant to play the role of landscape. But one of the things, again, that is triggered that category is the fact that in Magritte's work, whenever we see landscape or any tropes of nature and landscape, they are never, or I would say hardly never, appear without the trace of human scale, of human relationship. They're always tied very much to the human, and Magritte was very preoccupied with that question, as hopefully we'll talk about. Not to make my voice heard anymore, I would like to ask the 3 of you the very simple question to start with. Looking at that painting of a portrait of a person with the word mountain written on them, can we speak of painting of this form in terms of landscape painting? I don't know, Caitlin, if maybe you'd be willing to take on the challenge first.
This is a big challenge, but thank you, Yuval, and also I want to extend my congratulations to the whole team here on a really beautiful and impressive exhibition. There are many artworks here that I've admired in books and have never actually had the chance to see in person before, so it's very special to be here. The opening painting, the Phantom Landscape, from which you titled the exhibition, what I love about that work is that immediately you have a sense of Magritte's subversive humor, and also sort of a sense of dissonance. When I came to Magritte and landscape, it tended to be through the human condition painting, so in the second gallery. But in those works, I think there's kind of a classic Magritte trope or tendency to say that when you're seeing one thing, you're therefore not seeing something else. That the thing that you're seeing is preventing you from seeing something else. And so in that case, the physical painted canvas is preventing you from seeing beyond. What's interesting is that in that earlier painting, there's almost a sense of seeing double. That you're seeing the portrait, but then in your mind's eye, maybe bringing to it the sense of the mountain, through the word.
Allison, as a painter, I have to ask you, do you see this as a landscape paint? I kind of hope that one of you will say that you don't see it as a landscape.
I kind of like how efficient it is at doing a lot of really difficult things. I think about like the Mona Lisa, how you have her face and then you have this mountain behind, and you can't really do that anymore in a way. Like that would be too obvious. So I like how he's kind of collapsed with this very economical move, all the genres. So,
Cordula?
Yeah, I wasn't so surprised by that because I'm a romantic specialist. So when I was invited to come here to talk of Magritte, I was a little bit afraid because I'm like, well, you know, my specialty is 1800, I work. And then I saw the exhibition, I'm like, I can't shut up, this is so romantic. What was interesting about this is that Americans normally don't know German romanticism. And one of the real differences that Madame de Staël already complained about, the Germans think too much. And what you see, for me, what you see in that painting is actually going back to something that became really prevalent around 1800, when an artist like Philipp Otto Runge, who's one of these like premier German romantics, redefined painting. And he has a very famous quote where he says, within the precipice where everything is falling away, we're at the precipice of a new age, and it's the age of landscape. So that's what's always quoted, and then people think about Corot and Monet and whatever. But his next sentence is, and the key landscape is the Sistine Madonna. And the Sistine Madonna is not for us a landscape. So what he's really redefining is actually how we understand painting and how we understand signification. And there's a very conceptual core that I think somebody like Magritte visualizes in a way around 1800 you couldn't do. And the other connection, which is very clear, Freud's uncanny, comes from E.T.A. Hoffmann, which is a romantic writer. And so this idea of having a landscape that is a person, I think, for me, reflects the sort of quintessential romantic idea about how we see selfhood created in art. And that in some ways both is a sort of wrapping around of our reality that doesn't exist outside of our perception.
Caitlin, you mentioned the human condition paintings.
Yes.
The entrance. It's a great occasion to see that there are actually two paintings of that very well-known series in which we often see exactly a window concealed by a canvas. I want to start with a quote from a letter that Magritte wrote actually quite late in life, reflecting on this body of work, and he writes the following. He writes, "The problem of the window gave rise to the human condition. In front of a window, seen from inside of a room, I placed a picture representing exactly the section of the landscape hidden by the picture. The tree represented in the picture, therefore, concealed the tree behind it, outside the room. For the spectator, it was both inside the room in the picture and at the same time conceptually outside in the real landscape. This is how we see the world. We see it outside ourselves, and yet the only representation we have of it is inside us. Similarly, we sometimes place in the past something which is happening in the present. In this case, time and space lose that crude meaning, which is the only one they have in everyday experience." And what I was hoping to put forward as kind of a second question, or as a second theme, is exactly the question of substitution in the work of Magritte. Because you mentioned that there is a concealment, but the concealment in these canvases is of exactly, supposedly, what is behind the canvas. And he does in the similar way, we can see it in the works that have word and image being played, where we have, a word and an image. And sometimes the relationship between the word and an image is completely, supposedly arbitrary, or we are to ask ourselves, are these words replaced by the right images or vice versa? Sometimes we have a translation of language, and sometimes we have the case where we literally just look at the same word and the image of that word and try to think, what are we to make with that relationship? I suppose my first question is, to what extent do you think that this relationship is arbitrary in the work? To what extent Magritte is working systematically or thinking systematically about these relationships, or to what extent he's just having fun, just playing?
I tend to think that he's working very systematically, especially if you look at the series of the human condition. It's set up so precisely. There's a very sort of clear pictorial syntax, or almost a stage that's been set, and we know where we are as the viewer. Also in that series, it's very clearly paintings about paintings, and I think he's very sort of, he's going through all of the different possibilities that you can have of representing sort of within the studio and then outside. Also in that series, something that's interesting to me is that you confront the fact that we have the word landscape that is used both for the land and for the representation of that. Those are very interchangeable in the way that, elsewhere, if we look at the treachery of images, the pipe, it has a clear alternative. It's a representation of the pipe in the picture. In landscape, there's more of a slippage. So I think what Magritte is doing in that series is setting up the same conditions time and again so that he can draw attention to something or help the viewer understand something about looking at a representation, and that in each work in that series, it's a little bit different.
I see, yeah. Allison, I have to ask this, no, sorry, just because in your work, that substitution tends to happen, but happen in a slightly different way. But text does find itself into the language of the painting very, very often. Do you feel that there is, I think that is precisely where that place of meeting happens between you and Magritte, where I find there is something about I'll put it in another way. He often used to say, in a painting, words and images are made of the same substance. So the paint would allow these two universes to kind of exist together. Do you find that distinction really disappears in the painting between word and image, for example?
In Magritte's painting.
In Magritte's painting.
Well, I think a few things, but something that I was thinking just now when you were speaking is that he's also setting up these terms where he's painting the landscape and then he's painting his own painting of the landscape. So in a way, he's kind of doing this thing where nothing is real, but he's kind of showing you about the act. Like the self-referentiality of it to me is his own, let's say, his own disbelief. Like it's his own belief and doubt all the time, because it's not like he's just making a painting of a landscape and then saying, here's my version of it. He's saying like there's no objective version, and then it's all kind of deferral. Because I was thinking about, even in my own work, that like you want to paint this thing, but suddenly you're up against both the real and all the paintings that have ever come before it. So in a way, it's like he's narrowing it down. He's saying, here's the thing I'm painting, and here's my painting of that thing. It almost blocks out any other painting that was ever made, and any other landscape that you ever looked at. Like he just narrows the field down immediately to both things, the view and the painting. And suddenly you're in this like very enclosed, almost theater of what's possible with looking and making. But to me, he almost like refuses the world. He kind of creates this garden where nature is actually kept out, and any sense of real landscape isn't actually present at all. And that's why it feels so heightened and painterly and kind of relevant, I think, because it's like he's both dreaming and living at the same time.
So let's talk about, maybe that's a great entry to the question of style, of technique. I mean, do you think that, we had a little conversation earlier, and I mentioned that one of the biggest scholars of Magritte used to talk about his dryness of handling. That was the term he used for the way that Magritte paints, that felt so unemotional, so dry, so systematic, and so on. Looking exactly at that connection you mentioned earlier, Cordula, to romanticism, that would be the opposite of our image in our minds of a more expressive genre of painting, of relationship to paint. I don't know, how do you see that technique plays out for him?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I do think, I come back to my Kittori Kinzu, you have to let go of Delacroix in this case. You have to really go back to the German side of things. And I do recommend the Caspar David Friedrich show. This will not travel ever again across the ocean. One of the paintings, it's 800-pound security. They're not going to lend this anytime soon again. But I do think that this is something that I found so interesting, because just when I got the invitation, I had the first time paired Magritte with Caspar David Friedrich in my life, and then I got the email, and I'm like, do you want to talk about Magritte? I'm like, yes, because there is the sense is here really about self. And I was thinking a lot when I went through this exhibition. traditionally we associate selfhood with the expressivity of impasto, where the surface is agitated and we see it. But what you see in a lot of German Romanticism is an idea of the relationship between how we create the reality and the interiority where the selfhood lies. So when you look at Caspar David Friedrich, there's a beautiful portrait of him by casting in the show where you see Caspar David Friedrich, and he has a lot of windows. So he has that theme too, where the windows both realistic, but the grid is clearly marking the flatness of the painting. So there's a self-reflexivity. But in this portrait of this artist who is absolutely kind of fascinated with the minutiae of nature. He has these wonderful drawings of leaves, of trees, of little shrubs. But then he sits in his studio with the back to the window and painting a painting where the waterfall is coming into the room. And it's exactly that relationship, because the painting itself is completely enamel-like. Like there's no impasto. So for him, it's not the expressivity of the wild emotion on the canvas, but actually the reflectivity of our mind as a kind of foil between the reality of the painting and the question, what is reality? So what they really question in German Romanticism is, can we access reality at all? And here, of course, because they are very cerebral, it's Immanuel Kant, the idea that humans can never see the thing in itself, that we can only access reality through the filter of our limitations. And that, I think, I see here too, like something like this seems so away from the artist. And yet when you think about this whole play about language and the whole discussion about the arbitrariness of words, which is so late 18th century, because you have the one where he's writing 3 words in English and 1 in French. So, because Hiel doesn't mean nothing to my students who don't speak any French. But if you say heaven, it would be different to sky. So, and yet it's all the same thing. But I think that by having the cerebral element, you actually very much think about Magritte the person. Like we talk so much about Magritte and his thinking process. So it's a very subjective painting, even if you don't see his hand and like some emotional Delacroix-like wildness in the painting, and yet it's a different form of subjectivity.
I mean, I know that this painting, which is called L'Au-delà, the hereafter, is an incredibly monumental painting, and exactly that theme of the body as a monument, these tombstones, the sculptural elements in the next room seems to be bringing us back to the question that there is a certain there's a human presence always in these paintings, but there's also a question of exactly that expanse. I wonder, how does Magritte use that in his paintings?
I think some of this tension is already coming out, where Allison's point about the sort of arch artificiality of the works, and yet they're landscapes. They're landscapes that do not describe a specific topography. Right? There's no sense of an individual who stood there and had their own idiosyncratic or subjective, however we want to say it. It's not that experience of landscape. It is not landscape as sort of a vehicle of truth. When Magritte is painting clouds, they are not the clouds of Constable. They are a sign of a cloud that we are all responding to. And Magritte is creating a very complex construction through which we might ask, well, what can we learn through a painting? Which is what I've always enjoyed about his work a great deal. Your comment about sort of, do we understand ourselves as individuals or as sort of representatives of larger types reminds me of a comment, it's a paradox that Magritte sometimes wrote about with regard to the moon. And of course we know there's one moon, but each of us has our own moon as well. And that you're always sort of oscillating between those two different understandings of your position in the world, really.
But that maybe also raises the question of these tropes that Magritte is using. that we get very familiar with Magritte's clouds, with Magritte's horses, with Magritte's, he has these tropes, but he keeps repeating them and he repeats them differently. Allison, you mentioned earlier, we have 2 different paintings with horses in the exhibition, and the treatment is entirely different. But so this is, I guess, and this is again maybe going back to you, Allison, because I think as a painter, he really built a vocabulary that's very, very clear. I mean, some painters have kind of a more of a stylistic sense of, you notice their hand gesture more. Again, going back to what you were saying earlier. But in this case, really, there is a visual vocabulary. You could write a dictionary of Matisse's tropes. In your work, that happened. Sorry.
You said Matisse. You meant Magritte. It's okay. Yes. We know. Yes.
But I'm asking you as a painter, what are the privileges and what are the pitfalls of having a vocabulary built in this way, I suppose?
Well, one thing I would say that what I love so much about this wall here is that this is the same painter. And as a painter, I'm like, that's very truthful to what painting can be, which is horizontal and a sort of breadth of possibilities. And I think motifs are meant to be revisited. They're not, if you make something once, I don't really think that's possible. And also when you approach a blank canvas, it's never blank. Like these are all these myths that don't really exist in the studio when you're trying to make something. So the idea that, the cloud would come back, well, like, of course it would come back because it was never really there in a graspable form in the first place. So that feeling that you may have found something that you can almost engage with is very fleeting. So I feel that that's something very specific about painting, which is that it's fixed but inexhaustible. It has this frame, but it changes all the time. So that is the kind of idea also with a motif. It almost reinforces, again, painting's capacity to go beyond itself, like au-delà, So you have the cloud, but you're always thinking beyond the cloud. You're painting the cloud, but you're always painting, in a way, something else. At the same time, you're also painting a cloud. So every time you try and do something, you almost, it's like a valve. You press something down, and then this other steam comes out. And it can be very tricky, and it can be frustrating when you're trying to hold on to something. So you really also can't be too attached. And I think that despite Magritte looking like he's really tight sometimes, I think he's actually questioning it the whole time. And I feel that there's strangely a lot of freedom in his flatness or in his awkwardness. I mean, his virtuosity, which then can look really clunky. To me, these are all very knowing ways where he's constantly thinking about painting, and he's restless. He was also very prolific. It seemed like he had to kind of keep painting to keep talking or to keep asking the question. I think part of the way he made one painting was almost by making another. You know what I mean? So I kind of think that's why you have to see them together.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting because Caspar David Friedrich does exactly the same. So he has these early studies of nature, and they come back throughout the entire oeuvre. So when you look at all of them together, you can literally go like, where's Waldo? Like you can find certain groups, and then they pop up. And also his landscapes are completely fabricated. So even though they look on the first, if you just see that's a nice mountain landscape, but then when you know the geographies, they're completely disparate parts. There are the Alps, and then there's the Harz, and then there's, the Elbsteingebirge, and they're all kind of collaged together, but over a long time. So one thing you can't do, which artists don't, of course, like, is like, here's the sketch, there's the painting, so you can date the undated painting with the sketch. Not working, because the same sketch comes back 30 years later. So that's a no-no with Friedrich. And he does the same thing. He works, but I think Allison really captured that, like this obsession to try to grasp something, and it always eludes you, and then you grasp it again, and it eludes you, and you somehow nail it down, but you also want to do it better and again. And so he does exactly the same thing. It's just harder to see because it's not as obvious as with Magritte to really, I think that's the difference. Magritte is sort of the conceptual realization of something that is there in Nucci, but they don't do it yet in this abstract way that you can do it around 1900.
I think repetition, the problem with repetition with Magritte often is also the fact that he can be somehow depicted as slightly opportunist with it as well, because Magritte had kind of a prolific long career in which he also identified what the market liked or what he could or could not do, and we see those returns to certain things, and it's sometimes often, or I find difficult to distinguish the moments in which then close, but it is difficult sometimes to see when Magritte is just being very, very pedantic or interested or fascinated by a theme, or when he identifies a certain successful theme. And one of the biggest examples in the show is we have an incredible opportunity to see a variation of a painting called The Key of Dreams, which was probably 1927. Magritte painted the first Key of Dreams, which was the first painting in which he combined word and image, and he did this shortly after he arrives in Paris. In 1935, he does a second version of this painting, a different one. It's the painting in which you'll see in the main room with images and words underneath them, 4 images and 4 words in a window. And in this painting, he suddenly realized he's going to send it to America. So for the first time, he writes the text in English. And he clearly knows that this is going to a certain audience, but it also plays, at the same time, you could say it as kind of an opportunistic thing, but it's also the question of language he's playing with. This is kind of his chord, so it's not, and I guess these things tie very much to one another.
To comment on that painting, which is just incredible to see, the quality of the writing, it almost seems as if it's chalk on a chalkboard, which differs from either the Phantom Landscape or the cursive writing here. Yeah,
absolutely, yes. Speaking of this, I wanted to ask you, Caitlin, because Caitlin, your show really starts with this really odd turning point in which Magritte, what we call La Vache period, the period in which Magritte turned to this kind of much more, often is said, impressionistic style or humorous style and so on.
Or his nasty style.
Or his nasty style. Absent from this exhibition, does any of that period sits within or responds to this theme?
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you brought that up because I am very interested in the paintings that Magritte made in the 40s. So basically, from 43 until 47, he's working in what he might call his sunlit surrealist style or his Renoir style, and then in 48, it's clearly a much more expressionistic period vache, and. Of course, those paintings don't look like Magritte's because they don't have his compact paint handling. But what I think Magritte was doing in those works was actually deliberately trying to undercut the Impressionist brushstroke. So if you think of the stroke as deriving from observation and trying to carry sensation and really communicate in a sincere way, what Magritte is doing there is saying, I can give you the look of an Impressionist painting without any of that feeling. And the stroke, the Impressionist mark, becomes a sign that he can now do anything he wants with. That style of Impressionism is, it's almost like the substance of an Impressionist painting without any of the feeling of an Impressionist painting. So like in the way that we know how Magritte paints a rock or a piece of masonry, it's like the substance of an Impressionist work that creates that scene. He does continue to work through some of his problems, right? So it's there are actually word and image paintings done in the period vache style, and there are sort of picture within picture paintings of clouds and trees in the Renoir style. But I think it's a place where Magritte very directly looks at style as part of a convention of picture making. And again, subverts it.
I was about to ask you this in advance of the exhibition, or in advance of you coming here, but I actually thought that I'd rather have you surprised on the spot with saying, if there's a painting that you'd had to pick up from the exhibition, and you think that painting really stands for a representation of landscape, what would it be? And I'm happy to give you a minute to think about this, but I wonder, and the reason I'm asking this also is because I think that what's underlying the problem of landscape in this exhibition is exactly that Magritte, I think, doesn't allow for landscape to really take over any of the paintings, perhaps, but you might see this differently than I do, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I can go. I would say that one.
The apparition.
Yeah, the most unlikely candidate, because to me it really qualifies that idea of the fiction of landscape and the kind of abyss that I think he's doing with all the other works, but it's maybe harder to see because you do get caught in the illusion, and I think that's part of the pleasure of them. But in that one, it seems so stubborn and evocative, though, to me, and so surprising, and so contemporary. Like that kind of permission that he's given himself in that painting, I think is really incredible.
It's worth saying about this painting, this is a painting from 1928, a year more or less, or a bit less after Magritte arrives in Paris, and he is really getting to know particularly Miro and Max Ernst, and Magritte never really had a studio, which is interesting. Thinking of landscape, by the way, landscape painters paint outside. Magritte was painting from the kitchen primarily, and he never liked or never had a studio. Definitely when he arrived in Paris, he also didn't feel like this was the right expense. But he would frequent in a building where a lot of the surrealist writers and thinkers and painters were working, and Miro and Max Ernst are a huge influence on that moment in his career where he really shapes his vocabulary. And I think the abstract forms here, their roughness, their patches, their anthropomorphic shape or morphic shapes really plays into this. And one of the most beautiful thing about it is how stark it is on one side, but how one side of this cloud-shaped element actually does mold into the very stormy cloud weather. Cordula?
Well, my favorite landscape is the one with the two empty dresses and the landscape at the front, because I think that thematizes more than any other his relationship that the nature he paints, like the clothing we wear, is both how we create a self. And I think that the kind of paralleling of our exterior, the clothing, and the kind of way we look at the landscape as an exposition of ourselves is nowhere clearer than, and I love the coloring too, I have to say, like this kind of off pink. In German, you call it Fehlfarbe. It's a German word that has to be introduced into English. I think for me that's the most landscape, because it really, in the end, completely erases our categories. And that's, of course, something we haven't really discussed. Is like that in some ways this whole question about the landscape is continuing an academic tradition that so much in the 19th century they tried to get rid of, but it's very pernicious to actually do. So everybody says, yeah, now academic painting is dead, but then they talk all about these categories about landscape painting. And I think that painting challenges that perception of like, what is that landscape compared to a dress in a very fun way. And that's the other thing I was thinking about. He's so witty, and he's such a De Chirico. I mean, De Chirico is so important for him, but I really love De Chirico's brother Savinio, who's in contact. De Chirico's often so earnest, like he's very sincere, and Savinio is the one who's really witty. And I think that that would be a great exhibition to show the two, because I love the wit in him. And that too, this idea of irony, is such a romantic thing. And De Chirico was so fascinated with Friedrich Nietzsche. So you can spin them now really back. And Max Ernst, of course, did know all the romantics. Because I was thinking when I was asked, where is that connection beside me seeing things and projecting my own painter landscape into Magritte. But there is, of course, that set, and Hegel, who's so important for Kandinsky. So there is this German thought system that kind of underlies Paris in that period, and we often forget this because it's not the linear thing of the painting, but there is that same set of questions that drove the Romantics nuts still going on in that circle.
I think I would have to choose the large human condition oil painting that you see right when you walk in. I mean, that is I think, quintessential Magritte landscape, and just the paint handling is so beautiful and abstract and artificial, and that it immediately raises all of these questions about irony and what is the use of a landscape like this? What can that type of a painting tell us about traditions of painting.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, one of the remarkable things is seeing exactly that next to the cave painting next to it, in which you pointed out earlier. I've never thought about this, in which in that instance the canvas or the easel is sat, you said, outside of the cave.
It is.
Would you say a little bit about that?
Well, when you were describing so beautifully the problem of the window, right? Magritte is talking about creating a painting inside of a house, on one side of a window threshold, and that the thing that he is representing is on the other side. In that great gouache, the easel is outside, so there's sort of an additional sort of nesting or structuring where we're inside a cave. Then the easel and the canvas that is being painted is outside of that cave, beyond the threshold, and then the object of representation is even further. So there's sort of three different spaces that one can consider. And also the fact that the flame, the fire, does not have a light effect on the easel is also significant, because sometimes Magritte will create a very similar construction maybe on a beach, and the flame does sort of cast its light onto the canvas.
Going back to...
for a reality effect,
for a reality.
Yes.
Going back to the question of the tone that appear here, there is also the subject of the beyond, the subject of also which, I mean, Allison, who's contributing now to a publication, a small publication will come out in addition to this, just we're talking and writing about the frame in Matisse's work. Magritte, not Matisse, Magritte, the other. So I wonder if you think that the frames in all of these paintings, are they a captivating or liberating factor? I kind of struggle to see whether this frame, for example, is holding the sky, or is it the opening to the sky? Is that contrast, how does that work in Magritte's work?
Well, I will say that one thing that really struck me, especially when we think about the frames, having just done a very long period of research in Pompeii and looking at Roman painting around the time of the eruption and 300 years before, it's all the same themes, which is that it's all about doors, thresholds, windows, illusionism, playing with the wall. It's the wall and then going beyond the wall. And it's so self-referential from this very, very early moment when painting, let's say, begins a certain like Western figurative moment, that it doesn't begin there, but let's say it's constantly referred to as the excavations of Pompeii had an influence, but they were always painting the act of looking, meaning, so they were always painting frames, doorways, windows, balconies, like all these ways in which you have to contend with the act of the painting. So when I was, you can see this one of this random doorway into nowhere, like to me that's a very Pompeian theme. And I think it's kind of, I think it's just meta, it's like self-referential, and painting has always been self-referential from the very beginning. That's kind of the joke, that's the irony, that's the cynicism, and that's also the belief. Like it's always there because you can't outrun it, and that you're always working within a frame. And in a way, you have to almost reference it to get beyond it.
We were trying to organize a trajectory, a history. Exactly the thing you said is so, in a way, kind of made for failure. But to think a little bit about the art historical conditions of putting Magritte within a history of landscape painting, I wonder if it really, it really plays a role within that history, or is it a trope that he's really just looking at, and we can analyze from it and learn more about him. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, also in relation to more contemporary notions of what landscape is. And I leave it to you to maybe Cordula. No?
Yeah, I thought about this, but I don't think I have an answer to that. I have to contemplate that more. Maybe because I wouldn't write a history of landscape. I think that's my biggest problem here. It's like, I don't know. So I have to say I'm failing on answering you, and I will think about this more and mull it over, and yeah.
I'm tempted to suggest a couple of through lines. One would be the idea of reverie. At least when I was studying romantic landscape, sort of the idea of sort of the dreamlike process of being in nature, like Rousseau, sort of walking and coming to know yourself by stepping out of your kind of more traditional cultural identity. But the idea of reverie is tied to sort of early depictions of landscape. I think Magritte is using reverie in a different way, in a sort of a postmodern way. So that would be one. And then I think, and again, maybe this is just sort of what my received wisdom of what landscape was initially, is that it is the genre that is most tied to subjective knowledge of oneself. And I think Magritte is also asking his viewer to contemplate who they are within this construction, but coming up with a very different response and a different way that painting helps us know about ourselves and our condition.
Now I do have to respond to this because I think the second one I'm totally on board. The first one I think is again this difference between the German and the French. Like for the Germans, nature's always so unreachable and the self is always such a problem. Like nature is in some ways the exteriorization of the fact that we don't reach nature, we don't reach God. And we haven't talked about the spirituality because, like people still, like even in the exhibition, we got feedback that, there's too much religion in Caspar David Friedrich. I mean, I'm sorry, like that's how it is. Yes. Like, I mean, the man is searching for the place in nature, is a search for the place vis-a-vis transcendence. This is really essential. It's like, it's not very rooted in the here and now. And one thing that maybe there is this trajectory, and that's coming back that I wouldn't write it about landscape, but about self, is Friedrich is famous for these back figures, the repoussoir figures. And I think Matisse, and this is how I used Matisse in my... now I am Matisse-ified now. Okay, Magritte. I can't believe this. Magritte uses his canvases like Friedrich uses the figure, which is, it completely invites you, you project, and then it tells you can't go beyond. And that is what people get so fascinated in Friedrich, is that you always have the promise of seeing through the eyes of the artist, and you never can. But you also cannot be fixated. So you get fixated in the space of desire. And that's perhaps the history of landscape. If I have to write one from Romanticism to Magritte, I would write. Totally inspired by Caitlin.
I don't know if you want to add more to this, Allison?
I would just say that it's something about a frame that you have to step out of a threshold and really emphasizing this limit and the materiality of painting, and that it's an imaginative exit and entrance. So all space you enter and exit, and that all the ways in which he's constantly referring to the frame and the boundedness is a way to kind of see how it could be unbounded. Like that's the role of the viewer. It's to unlock his constraints.
Yeah. So I will conclude exactly by saying that when we were working on this exhibition, we had been planning a very traditional catalogue of Magritte, not Matisse, with all of the paintings in the show and everything. And I think as we went along and as we read more and more very comprehensive surveys of Magritte, we started feeling that we need to do something different for this exhibition. And we came across this fascinating publication that Magritte, who was not usually, he really did contribute to a lot of surrealist journals and so on during his life. He was never the editor, never the guy to be, it's not Breton and these people. And but in the 1950s, he suddenly had this fascination with the question, in a way, of landscape. And he started a journal that ran for 4 years, from 1951 to 1954, and included 14 issues that was called La Carte d'après nature, the map after nature, the idea exactly of layering in a way the map based on this topology of nature. And in some ways it was a beautiful small publication, and it really relied on the notion of the postcard at its essence, and the idea that the postcard in a way is the way we communicate or we send landscape to one another, and the way that that landscape becomes treated by the human presence, or being seen through that human presence. And I've actually recently read quite a lot of references onto that publication being kind of an observation of post-industrial landscape through the eyes of Magritte. So we are going to try and do a new special issue of that magazine, which included always contributions of colleagues and fellow artists. And in this occasion, we'll have Allison, who's contributing a piece, and Laure Prouveau, who's done the work here, but also another wonderful artist who's very relevant to Magritte today, and that's Sarah Swinner, with whom we've had the privilege of working in the past also. So I think this is kind of in a way a call to rethink some of these categories, and hopefully to contribute a little bit of information about an artist who's otherwise feeling, it's a very difficult thing to come to a painter like Magritte today and say, let's do a show and let's do something new about Magritte. But I think really landscape is a fascinating angle, and it's been a fascinating journey to reach this exhibition. It's been extremely wonderful, and I think we've all learned a huge amount from your different entry points to this subject. And I think looking at Magritte very seriously through these categories is, whether he is or is not considered or to be thought of as landscape painter, is completely irrelevant to the outcomes of the conversation. I also, as always, wanted to thank everybody for coming here tonight, and particularly to Alma and Daniela for enabling such incredible work to happen, and so generously thinking about what does it mean to make an exhibition in a gallery today. And lastly, and that's, I was promised to say, is please pick up your glasses so they don't break. But thank you very much, everyone, for today. Thank you very much.